At a glittering royal ball, she pulls the Vampire King into a dance and plays the perfect wife to fool the court, because an assassin's red aiming dot has landed on his forehead. With every slow step, she guides him out of the kill zone while hiding her own secrets. She isn't his bride, but the only shield standing between him and betrayal. The first time Mira noticed the red dot, it was on a folded sheet, no bigger than a pinhead, steady as a held breath. She stood in the corridor outside the linen room, arms full, watching it tremble on the white cloth as if the palace itself had blinked. Then the dot slid, slow and deliberate, from fabric to the stone floor. It crossed the pale veining of the marble, paused on the toe of her worn shoe, and disappeared as quickly as it had come. Mira waited a moment longer than was sensible. In the Royal Palace of Vesperglass, waiting could be mistaken for idling, and idling could be mistaken for disrespect. Yet she couldn't stop herself. The palace was full of quiet mysteries, doors that were never locked but always felt closed, mirrors that reflected candlelight a heartbeat late, corridors that seemed to change their distance when you walked them at night. A red dot was only one more small strangeness. Still, she carried the sheets inside and stacked them precisely, because precision was the language of survival here. Her difficulty that morning was not the dot, but her plant. In a shallow clay pot on her narrow sill sat a sprig of thyme she'd coaxed from a cutting months ago, back when she still believed the palace might allow her sunlight if she earned it. The rules were simple: shutters closed at dawn, curtains drawn tight, no human windows open when the day was bright. The King's Court didn't speak of it with fear, they spoke as if it were simply weather etiquette. Vampires, after all, had their needs. The humans, few, quiet, useful, learned to fit. Mira misted the time with water she'd saved in a chipped cup and watched the leaves sag anyway. The plant wanted what she wanted, warmth that did not come from candles, a day that didn't feel borrowed. She could have asked for help, but pride was a thin blanket, and she had only herself to wrap it around. So she went to work. Mira's post was ordinary, almost invisible, runner for the palace steward, a human pair of hands trusted with tasks no one else wanted to remember. She carried sealed letters between kitchens and conservatory. She counted silver in the chandlery room while the candlemakers hummed. She learned which footfalls meant a sleepy guard and which meant a noble who would turn and look through her as if she were part of the wall. The vampires of Vesperglass were not cruel. That was the strange part. They were courteous, even, in the manner of people who had forgotten what urgency felt like. When they spoke to her, it was rarely unkind. It was simply distant. Like speaking across a lake. And at the center of that distance, like a shadow that did not move unless the light made it necessary, was the king. Mira had seen him perhaps a dozen times in half a year, tall in dark formal coats that looked as if they had never known dust, hair pale as frost, expression unreadable in the way of those who had learned not to show their hunger. When he passed, conversation softened, shoulders straightened, servants held their breath without knowing they'd done it. The Vampire King belonged to the palace the way the palace belonged to the night. Mira did not imagine herself part of his world. She only tried to live in it without losing what was hers. On most days, that meant choosing small dignities. She said, please, to the scullery boys because they deserved it. She thanked the kitchen witch, old Yura, human, stooped and sharp-eyed, when Yura slipped her an extra piece of bread. She corrected her own posture when she was alone, not because anyone demanded it but because she refused to bend more than necessity required. And when she had a moment, she visited the palace library, where the lamps burned with a steady amber glow and the air smelled of paper instead of stone. The librarian, Master Saurin, was human too. His hair had gone silver early, and his manner was gentle, as if he had been speaking softly for so long it had shaped his bones. "You look troubled," he said one evening as Mira returned a stack of ledgers to the steward's shelf. "I'm not troubled," she lied, then sighed because lying in a library felt disrespectful to the silence. "I keep seeing a red dot. Like a tiny ember. It moves." Saurin's fingers paused on the spine of a book. "Where?" "Corridors," Mira said. "Once on my sheet. Once on a wall near the eastern gallery." Saurin considered her as if she'd offered him a riddle. "The palace has lenses," he said finally. "Old ones. Glasswork meant to gather starlight for scrying. The court once used it to watch the boarders, long before you and I arrived." "But why would it be inside?" Mira asked. "And in the daytime, when the shutters are shut?" "The shutters are a promise," Saurin said. "Not always a perfect one. Glass can find a way." Mira didn't like that answer. It made the palace feel less like stone and more like a living thing with its own curiosities. "What should I do if I see it again?" she asked. Saurin's gaze softened. "First, trust yourself enough to notice. Many people stop noticing, to make life simpler. Second," he tapped the desk lightly. "If you think something is wrong, tell someone who can fix it. Quietly. Without blame." Mira nodded, though she knew the trouble with telling someone in Vesperglass. Messages wandered. Fear wandered faster. And humans were often the easiest place for fear to land. She left with her ledgers and her caution, and for a while the red dot vanished from her days. Until the night of the Winter Concord. The Concord was not a celebration, exactly. It was a gathering of dignitaries from the surrounding estates, vampire lords in dark velvet, human envoys in careful smiles, an annual ritual of promises and trade. Mira had been assigned to the great ballroom, a place she usually saw only from a distance. Chandeliers hung like captured constellations. The floor was polished so thoroughly the candlelight looked like water. Her job was simple: keep the edges smooth. Refill glasses with dark wine. Replace napkins. Offer directions when asked. Be a moving piece of courtesy and disappear. Mira moved among gowns and coats, listening to the soft friction of conversation. No one spoke loudly. Even laughter sounded restrained, as if it had been trained. Music began, a string quartet playing something slow and old. Couples drifted onto the floor. Mira watched with the detached attention of a worker, noting where guests clustered, where a spill might happen, where an argument might need a discreet interruption. And then she saw it. A red dot bloomed on the pale forehead of the Vampire King. It was faint at first, easy to mistake for an ornament, until it brightened, steady and unnatural, a pinpoint of light that did not belong among candles. It sat there like the mark of a narrow, patient gaze. Mira's throat went dry. The king stood near the edge of the dance floor, speaking to an envoy with a calm expression. He did not react. Perhaps he could not feel it. Perhaps he did not know. Around him, courtiers smiled and bowed, their eyes attentive to everything except what should have been impossible. Mira's feet moved before her thoughts had finished forming. She crossed the room with a tray in hand, because a servant with a purpose was less suspicious than a servant with alarm. As she drew closer, she realized the dot was not painted or jeweled. It had depth, like a tiny star trapped against skin. Above them, high in the shadowed arches, a section of stained glass caught some stray angle of moonlight and city glow. But moonlight would not make red. Mira remembered Saurin's words, glass can find a way. A lens. A line of gathered light. Focused down into a single point. If the old scrying apparatus had shifted, if some mirror had been angled wrong, it might not be starlight it gathered. It might be the first thin edge of dawn creeping toward the palace's highest windows, concentrated into something sharper than any candle flame. Mira did not know what a focused ray could do to a vampire, but she knew enough to understand pain when she saw its possibility. She had seconds, and in those seconds she felt everything she usually kept buried, her smallness in this place, her fear of being noticed, her longing not to be the kind of person who only survives by staying silent. The king turned slightly, and for an instant the red dot slid toward his brow ridge. It brightened. Mira stepped forward. Protocol said she should bow and retreat. Protocol said she should never address him directly. Protocol said the king belonged to a world where her voice was a noise, not information. She did it anyway. She placed her tray down on a side table as if it were the most natural thing, and when the next set of dancers moved between them like a curtain, she used the moment. "My lord," she murmured, not as a plea but as a simple statement of fact, "dance as my husband, there's a red dot on your forehead." His eyes, pale, unreadable, shifted to her. Not with anger. With a kind of still attention that made Mira's breath catch, as if she had stepped into the center of a room she hadn't been invited to enter. For one heartbeat she thought he might refuse, leaving her exposed to every gaze. Then he extended his hand. It was not romantic. It was not a grand gesture. It was a decision made with the same economy as turning a page. Mira put her fingers in his, and the music carried them onto the floor. He held her at a courteous distance, the way a king might hold a diplomat in dance, proper, unyielding, controlled. Mira felt the weight of hundreds of eyes glance and then slide away, because a king dancing could be explained as politics, as performance, as nothing that required their interference. "Where?" he asked quietly, voice low enough to be lost in the strings. "Your forehead," Mira said, keeping her tone calm. "It's light. Focused. Like a lens." His gaze lifted, not to the ceiling, but to her, as if the ceiling mattered less than the steadiness of her words. "You noticed." "I've seen it before," Mira said. "Not on you. On walls." They turned. The red dot stayed on him, stubborn as a curse. Mira guided their steps, not leading, never that, but subtly choosing the arc of their movement toward the deeper shadow near the western columns. The king followed without question. In the shadow, the dot dimmed slightly, as if the beam had weakened. Again, Mira whispered, "Toward that column. The glass above, something is misaligned." He adjusted their angle by half a step. The red dot slid, flickered, and vanished. Mira's chest loosened like a knot undone. They continued the dance for another few measures, because stopping abruptly would draw attention. Mira kept her face composed, her hands steady, her breathing even. Inside, she felt the strange tremor of what she had done, not defiance, not heroism, but a clear choice to protect someone she did not know. When the music ended, the king released her hand. He did not bow to her like he did to other nobles, he did not thank her loudly, because loud gratitude would have made a spectacle of her. Instead, he said, very quietly, "You will speak with the steward after this." Mira's stomach dropped. Orders could be punishment in soft clothing. But his next words were measured, almost careful. "You will not be reprimanded for speaking." Then he was gone, absorbed back into the court's slow orbit, leaving Mira standing near the edge of the dance floor with her hands empty and her heart full of something she could not name. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of trays and polite murmurs. No one mentioned the dance. No one asked why a human servant had been on the king's arm. The palace was good at swallowing anomalies. After midnight, when the guests began to disperse, Mira was summoned, not to the throne room, but to the steward's office, a warm space smelling of ink and cedar. Master Saurin was there, unexpectedly, seated with his hands folded. Yora stood near the window with her arms crossed, looking as if she dared anyone to accuse Mira of anything. The steward, a vampire with spectacles that never reflected light, regarded Mira over a stack of papers. "You saw something," he said. Mira held her shoulders straight. "Yes. A focused light. I believed it could harm, at least discomfort, His Majesty. I moved him into shadow." The steward's pen tapped once. "And you chose to do so by dancing." "It was the closest way to speak without causing alarm," Mira said, then added, "because honesty mattered more than pride, and the only way to approach him." Saurin nodded slightly, as if to say, quietly, without blame. The steward turned a page. "There is an old apparatus above the eastern gallery," he said. "A sunward lens installed decades ago as an experiment, meant to provide filtered daylight to the human wing. It was sealed after a minor misalignment. We believed it inactive." Mira's mind flashed to her time, always starving for light. "It wasn't inactive," she said softly. "It found a way." The steward's gaze held hers. "You could have ignored it." Mira surprised herself by answering without hesitation. "I could have," she said. "But I didn't want to become someone who watches a danger and calls it someone else's problem. I have so little power here. Not using what I have felt, like losing myself." Yora's expression eased, just a fraction. The steward's voice remained neutral, but something in it warmed. "The lens will be corrected at once. And the human wing will receive a controlled light source in the mornings, under supervision. The king has approved it." Mira blinked. "He approved it?" "He does not enjoy discomfort," the steward said dryly, then paused. "Nor does he enjoy waste. Your time plant, for instance. It has been noted." Heat crept into Mira's cheeks. She wasn't sure whether to feel embarrassed or seen. "And you," the steward continued, "will receive a small change in duties. You will assist Master Saurin with cataloguing the palace's older glassworks and mirrors. If there are other misalignments, we would rather discover them by observation than by accident." Mira looked to Saurin, who offered her a calm, approving smile. It was not a grand reward. It was not a transformation into someone important. It was simply an acknowledgement that her attention, her ordinary human noticing, had value. She left the office with her footsteps light on the stone. In the days that followed, the palace did not suddenly become friendly or bright. Vampires still moved like quiet weather through the halls. The king remained a distant presence, seen rarely, spoken of carefully, always at the far end of rooms. But Mira's mornings changed. A new lantern was mounted in the human corridor, a glass globe filled with a pale, gentle radiance, like sunlight filtered through milk. It did not burn, it did not glare. It simply warmed the air a little, enough that Mira could stand beneath it with her eyes closed and pretend, for a moment, that the world was uncomplicated. Her thyme responded first, lifting its leaves as if remembering what it meant to grow. Mira found herself watering it with a steadier hand. She spent hours with Saurin in upper chambers she'd never been allowed to enter before, where dust lay in patient layers and mirrors leaned against walls like sleeping portals. They worked slowly, labeling each piece, learning which panes of glass were meant to magnify and which were meant to soften. Mira discovered she had a gift for it, not magic, not genius, just a steady willingness to look closely and admit what she saw. Sometimes she noticed red glints in unexpected corners, on a brass hinge, on the curve of a banister, little hints of the palace's old experiments. And each time, she didn't flinch away. She noted them, traced their path, helped Saurin adjust a shutter or curtain so the light behaved. One evening, weeks after the Concord, Mira was carrying a wrapped bundle of documents back to the steward when she passed the edge of the great hall. The doors were open a handspan, and inside she saw the king standing alone beneath a chandelier that had been dimmed to a soft glow. He was looking up, not at the lights, but at the stained glass above, as if considering the architecture's patient choices. Mira paused without meaning to. The king's gaze shifted, briefly, toward the door. It met hers for no more than a second. There was no command in it. No invitation. Just the acknowledgement that she existed in the same world as him, and that her small courage had reached him once. Then his attention returned to the ceiling, and Mira moved on, the bundle secure against her chest. She did not need gratitude to make her decision worthwhile. What she needed, what she had always needed, was the knowledge that she could act with dignity even when no one expected it, even when fear made silence tempting. That night, back in her narrow room, Mira sat by the sill and watched her thyme, greener now, alive in a way it had not been. The lantern's gentle light reached the leaves, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Vesperglass, she felt something settle in her ribs that was not resignation. The palace was still mysterious. It always would be. Mirrors still waited with their quiet, delayed reflections. Corridors still held their shifting distances. The vampire court still moved with old caution and older patience. But Mira had learned that an ordinary person inside an extraordinary place could still choose what kind of soul she would be. She could be the sort who survives by shrinking, or the sort who survives by standing straight. Outside, the night remained wide and calm. Inside, a small plant lifted its scent into the air. And Mira, listening to the hush of the palace, felt her own life, small as it seemed, become something she could hold with steady hands.